Thank you. Good afternoon. I think you're very brave. This is Saturday afternoon and you've just had lunch, so I won't disturb you if you need to sleep. As Louisa said, I'm Nigel Newcomen. I'm Prison Probation Ombudsman for England and Wales. I have a presentation which has both English words and numbers in it, so I'm afraid it's death by PowerPoint, but I will try and bring it alive a little bit as I go through it. Basically, I'll try and give you a little bit, firstly, of history about my job. Secondly, about what I do and the vision I have for the job. Thirdly, something about independence, because I think an ombudsman has to have independence to have meaning. I was asked by Louisa to say something about the staff I have and the resources I have, and then I'll talk about the important bits, prisoner and probationer complaints and death, which is what I do for a living. And a few words at the end about the future. Let me just give you a few words of history about my office. I suspect in Italy it's the same as in the United Kingdom. Some major changes of prison policy occur after disturbances, after riots. My office was created after riots in 1990. A judge who held an inquiry decided that one of the causes was that the prisoners lacked confidence in the complaints process, and they lacked any kind of belief that there was an independent element in the complaints process. So as a result, an independent ombudsman was invented to try and give some legitimacy, to give some hope, to give some credibility to the complaints process in prisons in England and Wales. And over time, the responsibility was expanded. So in 2006, the role was expanded to complaints from probationers, those that are on probation, and also from those that are in immigration detention, and I'll come back to the numbers we have in these places. And then in 2004, the biggest change in my office was that I took on investigation of all deaths in custody, and I'll take you through those in a minute. So that's the history. As I say, I suspect, like you, we have had a history of changing our prisons when we've had significant failure, and that's why my role exists. So my role is to investigate independently complaints by prisoners, young people in detention, immigration detainees, and offenders on probation. And also to investigate all deaths of prisoners, young offenders, immigration detainees, and offenders living in probation hostels. And as you'll see, there's quite a few. My vision for the organisation, which I wrote 4 years ago now, is to carry out these independent investigations. That's obviously what I do for a living, but also to try and contribute to improving safety and fairness in prison and on community service. I said the word independence a couple of times already, but I think I need to say a few words more about it. An ombudsman has only his credibility. If I was associated with the prison system, I would have no credibility in the eyes of those that I'm investigating. I'm completely independent of the prison service, of the probation service, of the immigration service. I'm a public appointment, which means I've been appointed by sitting in front of a committee in the House of Parliament. I have published terms of reference which emphasise the independence of my office. And I have a budget which comes from those departments which look after the prisons and probation services and the Home Office which provides the immigration services. I have unfettered access to people, to places. I can go where I want. My staff can go where they want. I can speak to who I want. I think when I went around a prison in Brescia with Louisa the other day, she was surprised to learn that I have keys. And the director of the institution was even more surprised to know that in England, ombudsman staff carry keys to go wherever they want. It's all part of the independent credibility of the operation. We need to be able to see everything and when we're investigating. I'm quite a big organisation. I'm the fourth ombudsman. I was appointed 4 years ago. I have a budget of about 8 million euros. I have over 100 staff. I have managers. I have investigators. I also have family liaison officers who look after the bereaved family of those that have died in custody. And I even have 3 researchers, and I will tell you a little bit about some of their work in a minute. In terms of the jurisdiction, in terms of what my coverage is, you can see there's about 350,000 offenders that I have responsibility for investigating if they complain or if there are deaths. I only apply my jurisdiction to England and Wales. There is a separate ombudsman in Scotland and a separate one in Northern Ireland. But we have a lot of prisons. We have a lot of prisoners. You may have heard me talk about it the other day. We We have about 86,000 prisoners in 140 prisons, 13 of which are private sector. I have responsibilities for private as well as public prisons. And I also investigate, as I've told you, immigration detention centres, which there are 11, and the National Probation Service, which is a new function, and the new community rehabilitation companies, which again, some of you may have heard me describe the other day. And they also investigate deaths that occur in approved premises of probation hostels, of which there are 2,000 residents of probation hostels in England and Wales. So quite a large responsibility, a large jurisdiction. Let me turn to the basic work that I do, and firstly to look a little bit more at complaints that I receive and how I deal with them. I've got to keep an eye on the time. First of all, just let me repeat why I think it's important to have an independent element in the complaints process. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights on inhumane and degrading treatment. One of the expectations I have, and I think the European Court has, is that those complaints about inhumane and degrading treatment are independently investigated. But the complaints process also provides a legitimate mechanism for prisoners to ventilate their concern. It's an essential part of being in custody, in humane custody, is that you have the capacity to complain, to tell people that you are not being treated properly. So my function in the complaints process is to help prevent unfairness and also to provide redress, to try and find answers to the problems that are presented to me. But it's not all one way. I'm not only a prisoner advocate, I'm also there to ensure that my findings demonstrate that staff behaviour was actually appropriate. So it's a two-way street, providing support and investigation into the prisoner's complaint, but on occasions finding that staff have behaved absolutely appropriately. And also I try to ensure that we encourage the learning of lessons to avoid future complaints. Some numbers. I get about 5,000 complaints a year. That's only about 1% of all the complaints in prisons. Most complaints are dealt with internally. Only about half of the complaints that I receive are eligible. I can only investigate about half of them because prisoners do not necessarily go through the processes that are required. Prisoners have to exhaust the complaints process in their institution. Probationers have to exhaust the complaints process of their probation service. And there's also a time limit, 3 months, and the complaint must be about something I have within my remit. So, for example, certain things I cannot investigate. I cannot investigate the clinical decision-making of doctors. There is another ombudsman that is responsible for that. So last year I investigated 2,400 complaints and tried to do so within 12 weeks, unless it was a very serious complaint. Where do they come from? Well, most complaints come from prisoners, as you'd imagine. 97% of complaints come from prisoners, and 27% of those come from long-term prisoners and high-security prisoners, the people with the most time on their hands and probably the most to complain about. Only 2% of complaints come from those on probation, and only 1% from those in immigration detention. Young people, women, and those on short sentences rarely complain. I suspect that we've undertaken some research which suggests that young people don't complain because their attention span is limited and they just are faced with a bureaucratic paper process which they don't like. Women, interestingly, in prison don't complain because they tend to get resolution to their problems at the local level. They just continue to chase a staff member until they get an answer. Men come quickly to the ombudsman. In terms of the type of complaints that I investigate, fortunately, relatively few are about assaults by staff. About 0.2% of the complaints I receive are about assault, although another 2% are about staff behaviour, about bullying, about racism, about other forms of misbehaviour. Quite a lot of complaints about administration, what nature of the sentence that's being served and whether it's been the appropriate category. But the largest proportion of complaints is about property, and I'll come back to that in a moment. In terms of outcomes, 39% of the complaints I receive I uphold. It's a high figure. It suggests an organisation, a prison system, which is having some difficulty. What do? I have power of recommendation. Those recommendations can include an apology, not a small thing. It's important for the prisoner's self-esteem to have an apology if one is appropriate. It's also important for the prison to recognise that it has trespassed into inappropriate behaviour, needs to demonstrate humility, to be humble, and to recognise that it needs to change. I can recommend compensation, particularly in property cases. I can recommend policy changes if the prison service policy is wrong or the probation service policy is wrong. And if necessary, I would recommend disciplinary action against staff. Last year, I recommended disciplinary action against staff in 18 cases, largely for assault. The vast majority of my recommendations are accepted, and the services I investigate have to demonstrate that they have put in place improvement plans. Turning now to fatal incidents, the other half of my job. Again, why is it important? Well, again, you're probably familiar with Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which has been interpreted as requiring independent investigation of all deaths in custody. It's important to establish the circumstances of death and in particular to establish good and bad practice so that you can give answers to bereaved families. Prisons are secretive, hidden places, and if your loved one dies in custody, you need an explanation. The information you receive is probably inappropriate and inadequate. So the focus of my investigations are the bereaved family. And I also assist the coroner, the judge conducting an inquest. My report is presented to the coroner as the basis for the inquest. And as I say, I'm very keen to ensure the learning of lessons. Last year I investigated 250 deaths. Of those, 155 were natural cause deaths, 76 were suicides, 4 were homicides, 15 were other types of death, mainly drug-related. The vast majority in prisons, although 7 were in probation hostels and 2 in immigration detention. So a large quantity of death in our prison system. As I say, in terms of outcomes, the bereaved family is central to the investigation. We have absolutely focused on trying to ensure that we could provide an explanation to the family of the deceased prisoner or deceased probation member. The bereaved families are consulted and involved in the investigation process. I have family liaison officers who go out and ask the bereaved family, what is it that you are concerned about? Do you have questions? Do you have information? We will investigate those questions. We will seek to try and give answers to the family as to what happened to their loved one. Again, I make the local and national recommendations as a consequence. They're nearly all accepted, and action plans are required. And progress, again, has to be measured by the Inspectorate of Prisons when they visit in the different prisons. Since I've been appointed, I've put a particular emphasis, you've heard me use the phrase already, learning lessons. Thank you. And on my website, if you're interested, there are a number of publications where I've tried to work through the lessons from the individual investigations, the large number of individual investigations that I produce. So, for example, in the last couple of months, I produced thematic works on suicides, the impact of mental health on suicides in prison, the impact of the early days in custody, particularly vulnerability of early days in custody, and issues of complaints of assaults. And interestingly, a publication about to be produced on dementia amongst prisoners, as the prison population in my country is rapidly aging. For the future, there's no likelihood of any reduction in the number of complaints in my jurisdiction. We already have the highest prison population in the EU. We have more long-term prisoners, so there's more people with time on their hands and more reason to complain. And the prison system itself is suffering austerity. There's been a 28% reduction in prison staff over the last 3 years, and reduction in regimes, so again, there is more to complain about. And again, you may have heard me talk yesterday about the radical reform of probation. That in turn is generating complaints to my office. Another feature is we're also encouraging a number of complaints is the reduction in legal aid, state funding for lawyers. That term in turn means the dependence of prisoners on the Ombudsman for complaints. There are also more deaths. As I said in passing, the prison population is aging rapidly. There are now 12,000 prisoners over 50, 4,000 over 60. The fastest growing segment of the prison population is over 60. This has been driven by longer sentences and historic sex offences being convicted. There's been a sharp increase in suicide in the current year, 30% increase in suicide this year, and a doubling of homicides. I can't explain these issues. I've said already that there's some significant issues of mental ill health, We're particularly concerned about new psychoactive substances. I don't know whether you have a similar problem, legal highs. But also we have stresses and strains in our system which suggests that they are not safe places. Prisons are less safe at the moment than they have been for many years. So there's no sign of reduction in complaints or deaths in my jurisdiction. No sign of reduction in demand for independent investigation. Unfortunately, there is a reduction in resources. I received an email yesterday saying that my budget for next year is reduced by 15%. So I'll have to devise smarter and far better ways of working with less. But my hope and my ambition is that we can produce good quality investigations which lessons can be learned and that complaints that can be prevented from happening in the first place by resolving some of the issues that have caused the complaint, and the preventable deaths can be avoided. Thank you for your time.